The police K-9 unit vehicles pulled into my neighborhood community center parking lot at exactly 2 in the afternoon, their German Shepherds and Belgian Malinois visible through the specialized transport windows. I watched from my apartment balcony as Carol Wilson, our homeowners association president, emerged from the building with her clipboard clutched against her chest, her face draining of color as she realized what was happening. For 3 months, she had been waging a relentless campaign against me and my service dog, threatening fines, legal action, and even eviction from the community I called home. She had dismissed every explanation about federal disability laws, every piece of documentation from my doctor, every attempt at reasonable conversation. What Carol didn't know was that I had spent 15 years as a police officer before my injury, and during those years I had developed some very specific connections in law enforcement. She was about to discover that her crusade against my legally protected service animal had just collided with a training exercise that would expose her ignorance to the very people whose authority she claimed to understand. My name is Benjamin Cook, and until a roadside bomb in Afghanistan changed everything, I had been living what most people would consider a normal life. I served my country, came home, joined the police force, and worked my way up through the ranks until that night when a drunk driver ran a red light and turned my patrol car into twisted metal. The traumatic brain injury left me with PTSD, anxiety attacks, and a medical retirement that felt more like a death sentence than a new beginning. That's when Luna came into my life, a golden retriever trained specifically to detect the onset of my panic attacks, provide deep pressure therapy during episodes, and guide me to safe spaces when my anxiety overwhelmed my ability to think clearly. She wasn't just a pet or even just a companion. She was medical equipment that happened to have fur, a wagging tail, and an uncanny ability to sense my emotional state before I even recognized it myself. When I moved into Sunset Gardens, a modest townhome community about 20 minutes from downtown, I thought I had found the perfect place to rebuild my life. The neighborhood was quiet, the neighbors seemed friendly, and the homeowners association appeared to be the kind of reasonable organization that focused on maintaining property values rather than micromanaging residents' lives. For the first few months, everything went smoothly. Luna and I established our routines. I began attending therapy sessions at the nearby Veterans Center, and I even started to feel like I might be able to create something resembling normalcy in this new chapter of my life. That peaceful existence came to an abrupt end on a Tuesday morning in March when Carol Wilson knocked on my door with the kind of aggressive persistence that suggested she had been building up to this confrontation for weeks. She was a woman in her late 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair, expensive clothing that screamed suburban authority, and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. When I opened the door, Luna immediately positioned herself between us, not aggressively, but with the alert posture that indicated she was reading my stress levels and preparing to intervene if necessary. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story is about to get incredibly satisfying, and I want to know if you're Team Luna or Team Karen in this epic showdown. Carol's first words set the tone for everything that would follow. "Mr. Cook, I'm here about your dog situation. We've received multiple complaints from neighbors about your pet. And I need to inform you that pets over 50 pounds are not permitted in this community according to our homeowners association bylaws." She spoke with the kind of authoritative confidence that suggested she had rehearsed this speech, but there was something in her delivery that told me she had already made up her mind about the outcome of this conversation. I took a deep breath, feeling Luna's warm presence against my leg as she performed one of her trained responses to my rising stress levels. "Ma'am, Luna isn't a pet. She's a service dog, and she's protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I have all the necessary documentation if you'd like to review it." I kept my voice calm and professional, drawing on my years of police training in de-escalation techniques. Carol's expression shifted from authoritative to dismissive with startling speed. "I don't care what kind of paperwork you think you have. The rules are the rules, and dogs over 50 pounds are not allowed, period. You have 30 days to remove the animal or face fines and potential eviction proceedings." That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with someone who was simply uninformed about disability laws. Carol Wilson had made a decision based on her personal preferences and was prepared to use her position of power to enforce that decision regardless of federal regulations. Over the next several weeks, she would prove just how far she was willing to go to get her way. The harassment began immediately. Within days of our first conversation, I started receiving certified letters from the Homeowners Association demanding that I remove my unauthorized pet from the premises. Each letter became more threatening than the last, citing various bylaws and regulations, while completely ignoring my repeated attempts to provide documentation of Luna's status as a service animal. I sent copies of my doctor's letters, Luna's training certificates, and detailed explanations of the federal laws that protected our right to housing, but every response from Carol dismissed these materials as irrelevant to the association's pet policies. The situation escalated when Carol began conducting what she called wellness checks on my property. These involved her walking past my townhome multiple times per day, often stopping to take photographs of Luna when she was in the fenced backyard area that came with my unit. She would position herself just outside the property line and document Luna's activities with the dedication of a private investigator building a case. When I confronted her about this behavior, she claimed she was simply ensuring that all residents were following community guidelines. The breaking point came when Carol organized what she euphemistically called a community meeting to discuss the pet situation that was affecting neighborhood harmony. She scheduled this meeting for a Tuesday evening and sent notices to every resident except me, despite the fact that I was clearly the subject of the discussion. I only learned about it when my neighbor, Stephen Evans, stopped by to warn me about what was being planned. Stephen was a retired teacher who lived in the unit next to mine, and he had witnessed enough of Carol's behavior to recognize that something wasn't right about her approach to the situation. "Benjamin, I think you should know that Carol's been telling people that you're trying to circumvent the pet policies by claiming your dog is some kind of medical equipment. She's got a lot of folks worked up about property values and liability issues. The meeting's tomorrow night, and she's planning to take a formal vote on whether to pursue legal action against you." That night, I sat in my living room with Luna's head resting on my lap, trying to process the reality that my neighbors were going to vote on whether I had the right to keep my medically necessary service dog. The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming, but it was also clarifying. Carol Wilson had moved beyond simple ignorance of disability laws and into the territory of deliberate harassment. She was using her position as HOA president to orchestrate a campaign designed to force me out of my home, and she was doing it with the kind of confidence that suggested she believed herself to be untouchable. As I scratched behind Luna's ears and felt my heart rate beginning to normalize, I started thinking about the resources and connections that I still had from my years in law enforcement. The police department where I had worked maintained strong relationships with various specialized units, including the K-9 division that trained with departments throughout the region. I remembered conversations with handlers about the challenges of finding suitable training locations and the ongoing need for realistic scenarios that could help prepare both dogs and officers for the complexities of real-world situations. An idea began forming in my mind, one that would require careful planning and perfect timing, but that could potentially solve my problem while providing a valuable service to the law enforcement community. If Carol Wilson wanted to challenge my service dog's right to exist in our community, perhaps it was time for her to get an education about working dogs from the people who understood them best. The community meeting took place exactly as Stephen had described. Carol had arranged the chairs in the community center to create a formal hearing atmosphere, with herself positioned at a table facing the assembled residents like a judge presiding over a trial. She had prepared a presentation complete with printed materials about property values, insurance liability, and the importance of maintaining community standards. What she hadn't prepared for was my attendance. I arrived 15 minutes after the scheduled start time, with Luna walking calmly beside me in her service dog harness, and took a seat in the back row. The room fell silent as residents turned to look at us, and I could see Carol's carefully planned agenda derailing in real time. She had clearly expected to conduct this meeting without my presence, allowing her to control the narrative and build consensus for her position without having to deal with any contradictory information. "Mr. Cook," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled irritation. "This is a private meeting for community residents to discuss neighborhood concerns." "I am a community resident," I replied calmly, "and since I understand that I'm the primary topic of discussion, I thought it would be appropriate for me to be here to answer any questions or address any concerns." For the next hour, I listened as Carol presented her case against Luna's presence in the community. She talked about precedent and property values, about liability and insurance concerns, about the importance of rules and the dangers of making exceptions. She showed photographs she had taken of Luna in my backyard, presented calculations about the potential costs of dog-related damages, and distributed copies of the community bylaws that she claimed supported her position. When she finished, she opened the floor for discussion, clearly expecting a chorus of agreement from residents who had been primed to see Luna as a threat to their investments and quality of life. Instead, what happened was something she hadn't anticipated. Stephen Evans stood up and asked me to explain the difference between a pet and a service dog. Another neighbor asked about the training that Luna had received and the specific tasks she performed. A third resident wanted to know about the legal protections for service animals and whether the Homeowners Association had the authority to override federal disability laws. For 45 minutes, I answered questions about service dogs, disability rights, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. I explained Luna's training, demonstrated some of her tasks, and provided clear information about the legal framework that protected our housing rights. By the end of the discussion, it was obvious that the majority of residents had no interest in pursuing legal action against a disabled veteran and his service dog. Carol's carefully orchestrated campaign had backfired spectacularly, leaving her isolated and increasingly desperate. That's when Carol made the mistake that would ultimately lead to her downfall. Faced with the collapse of her community support, she decided to escalate the situation by claiming that she had consulted with local law enforcement about the legality of my service dog documentation. According to Carol, the police had informed her that my paperwork was insufficient and that Luna could be classified as a public nuisance if complaints continued to be filed. "I've spoken with the authorities," she announced to the room, "and they've confirmed that this so-called service dog situation is not as clear-cut as Mr. Cook would have you believe. The police department has procedures for dealing with fraudulent service animal claims, and they take these matters very seriously." This was the moment I had been waiting for. Carol had just claimed to have law enforcement support for her position, which meant she had opened the door for me to bring actual law enforcement into the situation. More importantly, she had made this claim in front of witnesses, which meant that any contradiction of her statement would be publicly visible and impossible to deny. I stood up slowly, feeling Luna rise beside me with the fluid grace that marked her professional training. "Mrs. Wilson, I appreciate you sharing that information with the community. Since you've consulted with law enforcement about this matter, I think it would be helpful for everyone if we could get some official clarification about service dog laws and procedures. Would you be open to having some police officers visit our community to provide education about these issues?" Carol's expression shifted as she realized that her bluff was being called, but she was too committed to her position to back down gracefully. "Of course, I'm always happy to have official authorities confirm what I've been telling you all along." That night, I made a series of phone calls to contacts I had maintained from my years in law enforcement. The first call was to Andrew Hall, a sergeant in the K-9 unit who had been a rookie when I was finishing my career. Andrew and I had worked several cases together, and he had always been someone who understood the importance of community relations and public education. When I explained the situation, he was immediately interested in helping. "Ben, this is perfect timing," Andrew told us. "We've been looking for a location to conduct some community training exercises, and your neighborhood would be ideal. We can set up a demonstration that educates people about working dogs while also making it very clear what the legal requirements are for service animals." "When were you thinking?" Over the next 2 weeks, I worked with Andrew to plan a canine training demonstration that would serve multiple purposes. The primary goal was to provide valuable training and opportunities for police dogs and handlers. But the secondary benefit was that it would give the community a clear understanding of working dog capabilities and legal protections. We scheduled the event for a Saturday afternoon at the community center, with advance notice to all residents about the training exercise that would be taking place in their neighborhood. Carol's response to the announcement was immediate and predictable. She sent out a community-wide email expressing her concerns about having police dogs in the neighborhood, citing safety issues, and questioning whether the Homeowners Association had properly authorized the use of community facilities for law enforcement training. She also scheduled another community meeting for the Friday evening before the training exercise, ostensibly to address resident concerns about the police presence. This second meeting was smaller than the first, with only the most dedicated supporters of Carol's position in attendance. She used the opportunity to double down on her claims about service dog regulations and police procedures, insisting that the upcoming demonstration would vindicate her position and expose what she called the fraudulent documentation that I had been using to circumvent community pet policies. "Tomorrow you'll see exactly what I've been talking about," Carol announced to the assembled residents. "Real police dogs are nothing like this so-called service dog, and the officers will confirm that the paperwork Mr. Cook has been showing us doesn't meet the legal standards for legitimate service animals." Saturday morning dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for an outdoor training demonstration. I spent the early hours preparing Luna for what would likely be a stressful day, making sure she had plenty of water and opportunities to relieve herself before the crowds arrived. Despite my confidence in the plan I had developed, I was still nervous about the potential for confrontation and the possibility that Carol might find some way to disrupt the demonstration or twist the situation to her advantage. Andrew arrived at 10 in the morning with two other canine handlers and their dogs, a German Shepherd named Rex, a Belgian Malinois named Titan, and a Labrador Retriever named Scout, who specialized in detection work. The officers spent the first hour setting up their equipment and reviewing the training scenarios they would be demonstrating, while I briefed them on the specific issues that had been raised about service dogs and the misconceptions that needed to be addressed. By noon, residents had begun gathering in the community center parking lot and the adjacent green space where the demonstration would take place. I positioned myself near the back of the crowd with Luna sitting calmly beside me, both of us wearing our most professional demeanor. Carol arrived fashionably late, making a grand entrance with her clipboard and camera, clearly intending to document whatever she expected to see. The demonstration began with Andrew providing a brief overview of police canine units and their role in law enforcement. He explained the different types of working dogs, the training they received, and the legal protections that applied to them while they were performing their duties. Then he transitioned into a discussion of service dogs, their training, and the federal laws that protected the rights of disabled individuals to have their service animals in housing and public accommodations. Service dogs, Andrew explained to the assembled crowd, are individually trained to perform specific tasks for people with disabilities. They're not pets, they're not emotional support animals, and they're not the same as therapy dogs. They're working animals with legal protections under federal law, and those protections cannot be overridden by local regulations or homeowners association bylaws. I watched Carol's face as Andrew spoke, and I could see the moment when she realized that her position was about to be completely undermined by the very law enforcement officers she had claimed supported her. Her expression shifted from confident anticipation to growing concern, and she began taking notes with the frantic intensity of someone trying to find loopholes in information that contradicted everything she had been saying. The practical demonstration that followed was even more devastating to Carol's position. Rex demonstrated his ability to detect narcotics and apprehend suspects. Titan showed off his skills in building searches and crowd control, and Scout performed an impressive display of explosive detection techniques. Each dog worked with the kind of focused precision that made it obvious they were highly trained professionals performing complex tasks. Then Andrew asked me to bring Luna forward for a comparison demonstration. "This is Luna, a service dog who works with Benjamin Cook, a disabled veteran who lives in your community. Luna is trained to detect the onset of panic attacks, provide deep pressure therapy during anxiety episodes, and guide her handler to safe locations when his PTSD symptoms become overwhelming. She's not a police dog, but she's every bit as much a working animal as the dogs you've just seen." Luna performed flawlessly, demonstrating her ability to respond to my subtle cues indicating rising stress levels, positioning herself to provide physical support, and executing the trained behaviors that help me manage my disability symptoms. The crowd watched in respectful silence as she worked, and I could see the understanding dawning on faces throughout the audience. This wasn't a pet that I was trying to sneak past community regulations. This was a highly trained medical device that happened to have 4 legs and a tail. When the formal demonstration concluded, Andrew opened the floor for questions from the community. The first several questions were straightforward requests for information about police dog training and capabilities, but then the conversation turned to service dogs and disability rights. Residents wanted to know about the legal requirements for service dog documentation, the process for obtaining a service animal, and the rights and responsibilities of both disabled handlers and the communities where they lived. Andrew answered each question with the authority of someone who had spent years working with dogs and understanding the legal framework that governed their use. He explained that legitimate service dogs were not required to be registered with any government agency, that identification cards and certificates were not legally mandated, and that housing providers could not charge additional fees or deposits for service animals. Most importantly, he made it clear that homeowners associations had no authority to override federal disability protections. The Americans with Disabilities Act is federal law, Andrew stated firmly, and it supersedes any local regulations or private agreements that would restrict the housing rights of disabled individuals and their service animals. Any attempt to ban or restrict a legitimate service dog would be a violation of federal civil rights law. That's when Carol made her final fatal mistake. Unable to accept that her position had been completely demolished by the very law enforcement officers she had claimed supported her, she stood up and challenged Andrew's statements directly. "Officer, I think there's been some miscommunication here. When I spoke with the police department about this situation, I was told that the documentation Mr. Cook provided was insufficient and that his dog could be considered a public nuisance. Are you saying that the officers I spoke with were wrong?" The silence that followed Carol's question was deafening. Andrew looked at her with the kind of professional calm that police officers develop when dealing with people who have just said something spectacularly stupid, and I could see him processing the implications of what she had just claimed. "Ma'am, could you tell me which officers you spoke with about this matter?" Andrew's voice was perfectly polite, but there was an edge to it that suggested Carol had just walked into dangerous territory. "I'd like to follow up with them to make sure we're all providing consistent information to the community." Carol's confidence faltered as she realized that her bluff was about to be called in the most public way possible. She had claimed to have official police support for her position, and now she was being asked to provide specifics by an actual police officer in front of the entire community. The silence stretched uncomfortably as she tried to find a way to back down gracefully. "Well, it wasn't a formal consultation. I spoke with someone at the front desk when I called to ask about procedures." Her voice trailed off as she realized how weak this sounded compared to the authoritative claims she had been making for months. Andrew nodded slowly, his expression remaining professionally neutral. "I see. Ma'am, I want to make sure you understand that what you've just described isn't an official police consultation about legal matters. Desk personnel aren't qualified to provide legal advice about disability law or service animal regulations. If you had concerns about a service dog situation, the proper procedure would have been to file a formal complaint, which would have been investigated by officers who are trained in these specific areas of law." The crowd was watching this exchange with the fascination of people witnessing a train wreck in slow motion. Carol had spent months positioning herself as an authority on legal matters, claiming police support for her actions, and threatening legal consequences for anyone who disagreed with her interpretation of the rules. Now she was being gently but firmly corrected by an actual law enforcement officer who was making it clear that her claims had no basis in reality. But Carol wasn't finished digging her hole deeper. Instead of accepting the correction gracefully, she doubled down on her position with the kind of desperate aggression that people display when they realize their authority is crumbling. "I don't care what you're saying now. I've been dealing with this situation for months, and I know what I was told. This dog is too big for our community, the documentation is questionable, and I have every right as HOA president to enforce our rules regardless of what anyone claims about federal law. The moment those words left her mouth, I knew that Carol Wilton had just ended her reign as the neighborhood tyrant. She had just publicly stated in front of multiple witnesses, including police officers, that she intended to ignore federal disability law in favor of her personal interpretation of community rules. She had also directly contradicted the information provided by law enforcement officers, essentially calling them liars or incompetents. Andrew's response was swift and decisive. Ma'am, I need to be very clear about something. What you've just described would constitute a violation of federal civil rights law. The Americans with Disabilities Act doesn't include exceptions for homeowners, associations, or community bylaws. If you attempt to take action against a disabled resident based on their use of a service animal, you would be exposing yourself and your organization to significant legal liability. Michelle Edwards, a civil rights attorney who specialized in disability law and who I had invited to observe the demonstration, chose this moment to step forward and introduce herself. Excuse me, I'm Michelle Edwards, and I'm an attorney specializing in disability rights law. I've been following this situation, and I think it would be helpful for everyone to understand the potential consequences of what's being discussed here. Carol's face went pale as she realized that the situation had just escalated beyond anything she had anticipated. Not only were her claims being contradicted by police officers, but now there was a lawyer present who could speak to the legal implications of her actions. The crowd shifted nervously, sensing that they were witnessing something more serious than a simple neighborhood dispute. Michelle continued in the calm, professional tone that attorneys use when they want to be absolutely certain that everyone understands the gravity of what they're saying. Under federal law, any attempt to restrict housing access based on disability status or the use of service animals is considered discrimination. This includes actions taken by homeowners, associations, property management companies, or individual landlords. The penalties for such discrimination can include monetary damages, attorney fees, and injunctive relief requiring policy changes. The crowd was completely silent now, absorbing the implications of what they had just heard. Carol stood frozen, apparently realizing for the first time that her months-long campaign against me and Luna had potential legal consequences that extended far beyond simple community politics. The confident authority figure who had been dominating neighborhood meetings and issuing ultimatums had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely frightened by the situation she had created. As the crowd began to disperse, I noticed that several residents approached me to apologize for the situation and to express their support for Luna and me. Stephen Evans was among the first, shaking my hand and telling me that he was embarrassed by Carol's behavior and impressed by how professionally I had handled the entire situation. Other neighbors followed, some asking questions about Luna's training, others simply wanting to meet her and see her work up close. Carol, meanwhile, had retreated to the edge of the parking lot where she stood with her clipboard pressed against her chest, apparently trying to process what had just happened to her carefully constructed campaign. I could see her having an intense conversation with the few residents who had consistently supported her position, but even they seemed shaken by the legal implications that had been raised during the demonstration. Over the next few days, the aftermath of the K9 demonstration played out exactly as I had hoped it would. Word of Carol's public humiliation spread quickly through the community, and her support base evaporated as residents realized that following her lead could expose them to legal liability. The few neighbors who had been actively supporting her harassment campaign suddenly became very interested in distancing themselves from her position. The first sign that Carol's position had fundamentally changed came on Tuesday morning when I found a certified letter in my mailbox. Instead of another threatening demand to remove Luna from the community, this letter was a formal retraction of all previous correspondence regarding my service dog. The letter stated that upon further review of applicable laws and regulations, the Homeowners Association acknowledged that service animals were exempt from pet restrictions and that no further action would be taken regarding Luna's presence in the community. The letter was signed by Carol Wilson, but the legal language and careful phrasing suggested that it had been written by an attorney. Someone had clearly explained to Carol the legal jeopardy she had created for herself and the Homeowners Association, and she had been advised to retreat from her position as quickly and completely as possible. But the most satisfying development came the following week when Stephen Evans stopped by to share some neighborhood gossip. According to Stephen, Carol had called an emergency meeting of the Homeowners Association Board to discuss her future as president. The other board members, apparently concerned about the legal liability she had created and embarrassed by her public confrontation with law enforcement officers, had suggested that it might be time for her to step down from her leadership role. The final chapter of Carol's downfall came 2 weeks later when a new HOA president was elected to replace her. The new president, Heather Ross, was a retired nurse who had experience working with disabled patients and who understood the importance of service animals in healthcare. One of her first acts was to send a community-wide letter clarifying the association's policy on service animals and reaffirming the community's commitment to compliance with federal disability laws. Carol remained in the neighborhood, but her influence and authority had been completely eliminated. She no longer organized community meetings, no longer patrolled the neighborhood with her clipboard, and no longer positioned herself as the arbiter of community standards. The few times I encountered her in the months that followed, she avoided eye contact and hurried past without speaking. The transformation in my daily life was remarkable. Instead of dreading trips to check my mail or walks with Luna around the community, I found myself enjoying the peaceful environment that had originally attracted me to Sunset Gardens. Neighbors who had previously been neutral or slightly hostile became genuinely friendly, often stopping to ask about Luna's training or to share their own experiences with working animals. The canine demonstration had accomplished something that months of documentation and legal explanations could never have achieved. It had provided visual, tangible proof of what working dogs could do and had established the credibility of law enforcement officers who understood these issues professionally. More importantly, it had exposed Carol's claims about police support as the fabrications they had always been, demolishing her authority in the most public way possible. The success of the demonstration also had broader implications beyond my immediate situation. Andrew Hall contacted me several weeks later to let me know that the K-9 unit had received requests from other communities to provide similar educational programs. Apparently, word had spread through law enforcement circles about the effectiveness of using working dog demonstrations to educate the public about service animal laws and disability rights. "What you did was brilliant," Andrew told me during one of our follow-up conversations. "You found a way to solve your immediate problem while providing a valuable service to both the law enforcement community and disabled individuals who face similar challenges. We're planning to develop this into a regular community outreach program." Michelle Edwards had similar feedback from the legal perspective. She told me that the case had become a model for how disabled individuals could advocate for their rights while building community support rather than simply relying on legal threats. The combination of education, professional credibility, and public demonstration had been far more effective than traditional legal approaches in changing attitudes and behaviors. The experience also taught me valuable lessons about advocacy and self-representation. I had spent months trying to resolve the situation through reasonable discussion and documentation, becoming increasingly frustrated as Carol dismissed every attempt at rational conversation. It wasn't until I shifted strategies and used my law enforcement connections to create a public education opportunity that I was able to break through her resistance and expose the weaknesses in her position. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Carol had actually done me a favor by escalating the situation to the point where a public resolution became necessary. If she had been more reasonable in her initial approach, I might have spent years dealing with low-level harassment and passive-aggressive behavior that would have been difficult to address directly. Instead, her aggressive overreach created the opportunity for a comprehensive solution that not only resolved my immediate problem, but also established a framework for protecting other disabled residents who might face similar challenges in the future. 6 months after the K-9 demonstration, I received an unexpected visit from Brian Reed, a disabled veteran who was considering moving into the community. Brian had heard about the situation with Carol Wilson and wanted to know whether Sunset Gardens was truly welcoming to disabled residents or whether the policy changes were just superficial responses to legal pressure. I spent an hour walking around the neighborhood with Brian and his service dog, a German shepherd named Atlas, who had been trained to assist with mobility issues related to Brian's combat injuries. We visited the community center, met several neighbors, and discussed the practical aspects of living in the community with a service animal. By the end of our conversation, Brian was convinced that Sunset Gardens had genuinely transformed its approach to disability issues. "It's amazing that what happened here," Brian told me as we concluded our tour. "Most communities either discriminate quietly or comply with the law reluctantly. This place seems to have actually embraced the idea that disabled residents and their service animals are valuable members of the community." Brian's observation highlighted one of the most significant outcomes of the entire experience. The canine demonstration hadn't just resolved my immediate problem with Carol Wilson, it had fundamentally changed the community's understanding of disability issues and created a culture that was genuinely welcoming to disabled residents. Instead of viewing service animals as problems to be managed or exceptions to be tolerated, residents now saw them as impressive examples of the human-animal partnership that enabled disabled individuals to live independently. The success of the approach I had used also attracted attention from disability advocacy organizations and veterans groups throughout the region. I was invited to speak at several conferences about effective strategies for addressing housing discrimination, and the K9 demonstration model was adopted by other communities facing similar challenges. Working on these training programs also helped me process my own experience and understand the broader implications of what had happened with Carol Wilson. I realized that her behavior wasn't just personal animosity toward me and Luna, but part of a larger pattern of discrimination that disabled individuals face when trying to access housing, employment, and public accommodations. One of the most rewarding aspects of this advocacy work was hearing from other veterans who had faced similar situations and had been inspired by my approach to stand up for their rights. A Marine veteran named Michael Torres contacted me after hearing about the K9 demonstration through his local veterans organization. Michael had been dealing with harassment from his apartment complex management company, which was trying to charge him pet deposits and monthly fees for his service dog, despite the clear legal prohibition against such charges. "I was ready to just pay the fees and avoid the confrontation," Michael told me during our initial phone conversation. "But after hearing about how you handled your situation, I realized that backing down would just encourage them to continue discriminating against other disabled tenants." With guidance about his legal rights and strategies for documenting the discrimination, Michael was able to resolve his situation quickly and effectively. The management company's attorney advised them to waive all fees and deposits after Michael presented them with clear information about federal disability law and made it obvious that he understood his rights and was prepared to enforce them. Similar stories came from veterans throughout the region who had used variations of my approach to address discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations. The common thread in all these success stories was the importance of education, documentation, and strategic use of professional allies to establish credibility and apply pressure when necessary. But perhaps the most meaningful feedback came from Luna herself, in the form of improved behavior and reduced stress responses during our daily activities. The months of conflict with Carol Wilson had taken a toll on both of us, creating anxiety and tension that affected Luna's ability to perform her trained tasks effectively. As the situation resolved and our daily routine returned to normal, I could see Luna relaxing and regaining the confident, focused demeanor that marked her professional training. The experience also deepened my appreciation for the complexity and sophistication of Luna's training. During the K9 demonstration, I had watched the police dogs perform their specialized tasks with obvious admiration for their skills and dedication. But seeing Luna work alongside those dogs had given me a new perspective on her own abilities and the precision required for her to perform her medical support tasks effectively. The long-term impact of the K9 demonstration extended far beyond my personal situation or even the immediate community. Andrew Hall's K9 unit began receiving requests from homeowners associations, apartment complexes, and municipal governments throughout the region to provide similar educational programs. The success of our initial demonstration had shown that law enforcement agencies could play a valuable role in preventing discrimination by educating communities about disability rights and service animal laws. We've done more community outreach in the past year than we had in the previous 5 years combined, Andrew told me during one of our regular follow-up conversations. The K9 demonstration model has become a standard part of our community relations program, and we're seeing real results in terms of reducing service animal discrimination complaints. The program's success had also attracted attention from federal agencies responsible for enforcing disability rights laws. Representatives from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division contacted me to discuss the demonstration model and its potential for broader application in communities across the country. This federal interest led to opportunities to present the K9 demonstration model at national conferences focused on disability rights and community relations. I found myself speaking to audiences of law enforcement officers, disability advocates, legal professionals, and community leaders about the strategies and principles that had made our local program successful. The success of the program also led to opportunities to work with service dog training organizations to help them better prepare new handlers for the challenges they might face in housing situations. Many of these organizations focus primarily on the technical aspects of service dog training and partnership, but they were beginning to recognize the importance of also preparing handlers to advocate for their legal rights. Working on these training programs brought the entire experience with Carol Wilson full circle. What had started as a personal housing crisis had evolved into a systematic approach for preventing and addressing service animal discrimination that was now being used to help disabled individuals throughout the country. 2 years after the K9 demonstration that ended Carol Wilson's reign of harassment, I received a letter that brought the entire experience into perfect perspective. The letter was from a disabled veteran named Robert Martinez, who had recently moved into Sunset Gardens with his service dog, a Belgian Malinois named Thunder, who assisted with mobility and medical alert tasks. "Dear Benjamin," the letter began, "I wanted to thank you for the work you did to make this community welcoming to disabled residents and their service animals. When I was researching places to live, Sunset Gardens kept coming up in discussions among veterans as an example of how communities should treat disabled residents. The reputation you helped establish here made my housing search much easier and gave me confidence that Thunder and I would be accepted and respected." Reading Robert's letter reminded me of all the reasons why I had fought so hard to keep my place in Sunset Gardens, rather than simply moving somewhere else when Carol's harassment began. It wasn't just about my personal housing situation. It was about establishing the principle that disabled individuals have the right to live in the communities of their choice without facing discrimination or harassment. The success of that fight had created benefits that extended far beyond my own situation. Other disabled veterans like Robert were now able to move into the community with confidence, knowing that their rights would be respected and their service animals would be welcomed. The educational programs that had grown out of the K9 demonstration were helping disabled individuals throughout the region access their housing rights more effectively. As I finished reading Robert's letter, Luna looked up at me from her favorite spot on the living room carpet, her tail wagging slightly as she sensed my positive emotional state. She had no way of understanding the broader implications of what we had accomplished together, but she knew that our home was secure, our community was welcoming, and our daily routine was peaceful and predictable. That evening, as we took our usual walk around the neighborhood, I reflected on how much had changed since those difficult months when Carol Wilson had seemed determined to drive us out of the community. The same streets that had once felt hostile and unwelcoming were now filled with neighbors who knew Luna by name and understood the important work she did. The experience had taught me that sometimes the most effective way to fight discrimination is not through private negotiation or legal threats, but through public education that exposes ignorance and builds community support for doing the right thing. Carol Wilson's downfall hadn't come from legal action or administrative complaints, but from her own words being contradicted by knowledgeable professionals in front of the people whose respect she needed to maintain her authority. Today, as I write this account of those events, Luna is sleeping peacefully beside my desk, secure in the knowledge that this is our permanent home and that our community values and protects our right to be here. The story of Carol Wilson's campaign against my service dog And its ultimate failure serves as a reminder that federal disability rights laws are only as strong as the people who are willing to enforce them and the communities that are willing to learn about and respect them. In the end, Carol Wilson did me a favor by escalating her harassment to the point where a comprehensive public response became necessary. Her overreach created the opportunity for a solution that was far more effective and lasting than anything that could have been achieved through private negotiation or quiet legal settlement. Her defeat became the foundation for a community transformation that continues to protect and welcome disabled residents and their service animals. And Luna, the service dog that Carol Wilson tried so hard to ban from our community, has become something of a neighborhood celebrity, known and respected by residents who understand that her presence makes our community stronger, more inclusive, and more committed to the principles of equal access and dignity that define the best of American values.